2 weeks ago I made this. This is a pixel art recreation of the inn that you find in the Wire Forest in Digimon World 3, and it was the very first scene that I ever made in pixel art, and it was a really useful exercise, so this week I want to do it again. This time I wanted to be a bit more ambitious, and I wanted to make an entire area and not just a single building. So I picked the Oasis that you find in the western sector, still in Digimon World 3. Alright, so this is what it looks like in-game, and before I actually start the time-lapse, I want to mention that there's a few things that I want to change. I generally really like the concept of an artificial oasis powered by a big-ass tap in the middle of it, but there's a few things that they did that I'm not a huge fan of. I feel like they built it out a bit too much, and it kind of loses the warmth and the hospitality that you might expect from an oasis. So I'm going to be replacing this like wood structure thing for a sandy kind of beach kind of thing to hopefully bring some of that warmth back. I wasn't super confident when I started this, so I started it really slow. Here I'm just blocking out the main shapes of the landscape, just laying down some very basic shapes like just squares and rectangles to define the paths and just the general composition of the thing. And that ended up being really useful. I really recommend it. You're going to see me scoot up the whole thing quite a bit because I started by drawing it way too high, and so you didn't have enough space for the actual water. And doing those kind of changes further down the line, like when I started detailing or maybe even colouring in, would have been a nightmare. And then I didn't actually start detailing the ground, but I actually started adding the major kind of details that you were going to see in the scene. So just defining where the bridge was going to be, defining where the palm trees were going to be, where the pipes, the satellite towers are, just to, again, not worry about any kind of detailing, but just worry about the composition. It's just that when you're working on these kind of details, you kind of have to draw them fully. There's not much of a way to simplify them down because they're already very small. So I added about as much detail as I wanted to, and only then did I move on to detailing the ground. I'm working on a canvas of 256 pixels by 224, and that was the resolution of the Super Nintendo. There's not any particular reason that I chose that resolution other than it felt roughly right, but I did try and make sure that the sizing of everything felt somewhat consistent with the one that I did 2 weeks ago. So the paths, for example, are exactly as wide. This whole piece is actually a good example of what I was talking about 2 weeks ago, about how much detail you should keep when you're referencing an artwork. Like you can see in the original, there's about a dozen palm trees and they're all fairly small. But if I drew them at this actual size, and if I drew that many, it would just look like a hot mess of random pixels. So instead what I did, I just kept 4 of them, 2 big ones in the center and then 1 smaller ones on either side. But I made them a lot bigger than they were in the original. And so that way the whole thing seems a lot clearer to read, is a lot less overwhelming, I guess, on the eyes. I had a few issues, I think you can see here, with drawing circles in this isometric perspective. When a circle is parallel to the ground, that's fine because it's just an ellipse. I have an ellipse tool, I can do that with the ellipse tool. But when they are perpendicular to the ground, when they're vertical, like this gear that I'm drawing right now, it's a lot tougher because it's skewed in a way that isn't really easy to freehand, and in a way that you can't use an ellipse tool for that. So what I did was I actually started by drawing a rectangle that was roughly the size of the circle that I wanted, and then I chipped in the corners to eventually approach something that I thought was resembling a rectangle. It's not a perfect technique. Here you see the gear ended up being not quite the right axis. It ended up facing a bit too forward, a bit too much in the direction of the camera. So if you have any advice on how to draw circles like that in isometric perspective, I'm more than happy to hear them. But I just had to run with that because it was still a lot better than anything I could have freehanded. For the rocks here, I'm just laying down a few roughly believable shapes. There's not really any thought to it. Obviously the bulk of the work is going to be when I'm actually doing the colouring, but I'm just making sure that I have something that I can work with later down the line. And after that, the line work was done, so I moved on to the colouring. Picking colours for this one was a bit tricky because the whole thing is very brown. And typically you want to avoid having shades that are too similar to each other in your color palette in pixel art. But in this case, you really have two kinds of materials. You have the sandstone, which is going to be like a light brown, and the wood, which is wood, so it's brown. But if I had made these two materials the same color, the whole thing would have been a bit more difficult to read, and I'm guessing would have looked a bit flat. So I had to use two different shades of brown. And to help differentiate them, I made the rock a lot less saturated, they're a lot more grey. And I also cranked out the hue shifting up to like 100. If you look at the shadows in the wood, it looks dark brown, right? But if you look at the shadows of the rock, the dark rock that I use on the side, they're almost purple. And that really helps differentiate the two hues. Here I'm going to be spending a bit of time on the palm trees, because it's quite important, especially in an isometric perspective, when everything is the same size no matter where it is on the screen. It's important for everything that belongs kind of in the same family to have a similar level of rendering. So like, it would be weird if the palm trees were very heavily shaded and had a lot of detail, but just on the side the satellite tower was very flat and very simply shaded. You're going to see later down the line, but for the ground and the walls, I was a lot more minimalistic in the way that I shaded it, but that's fine because it belongs in, it's a different kind of thing. The level of rendering is actually something you can play with to differentiate between different elements, but elements that kind of belong with each other should look somewhat similar. Spending time on like actually building detail in the scene like that is probably my favorite thing about pixel art. The rocks on the side here were a bit scary, to be honest, because they represent a lot of like a very big part of the screen, and I didn't feel too confident about my abilities to build textures. But it ended up being a bit easier than I expected, and mostly because of how much I was limiting myself in terms of colors. The whole walls uses only 3 shades of brown, and by doing that you're effectively collapsing the rocks in just having 3 sides. So what I did was, for every single rock I started with the top part, the part that was the lightest, and usually that was enough for me to have a feeling of just how the rock was supposed to look like in 3D, and with that it was a lot easier to put the darker shade. The only thing then was to make sure that the rocks didn't look too much like one another, to make sure that it didn't feel repetitive, and to make sure that they were like physically sound, I guess. At this point, I'm mostly just adding detail here and there. Like, I'm going to be whizzing by across the screen quite a bit, and I don't suspect that's going to be very enjoyable to watch. So I think I'm going to cut the time lapse here and show you the finished scene. So I guess I'm going to start with what I don't like about the scene. I, compared to the original, brought the walls a lot closer to the path, right up against the path. And I don't think that was actually a very good idea. It makes the whole scene feel a lot more claustrophobic. Overall though, I'm really happy with what this looks like. It's a lot better than I expected when I started it, to be honest. I feel though, for the next few scenes that I'm going to be making, that I want to start making my own scenes. I don't want to develop too many habits that are like specific to remaking artwork. I want to be able to make my own scenes, so that's probably what I'm going to be making next. But that's going to have to wait for another video, because yeah, I'm going to wrap it up for this one. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you so much for watching. Take care, and I'll see you next week.